100%, and maybe this will be controversial for some people. I'm not like diminishing the impact of the Nakba at all, but there is one difference between like the population transfer and the way that they did it. Like they didn't just straight up rip through. They killed 15,000 Palestinians in the Nakba, right? But they didn't kill like 100,000, 200,000 Palestinians. It would have been crazy to do so right after the Holocaust anyway. Like people would have been like, that's insane. What are you doing? You have to put a stop to that. And they simply forcibly displaced 750,000 people instead of just like pulling an America or pulling a Turkey, as a matter of fact. You know what I mean? There have been countries that have engaged in similar things closer to Israel's development, and they didn't really do that. They basically were like, we're just going to butcher one village or a couple villages, 2 villages, 3 villages, and then everywhere else that we go to, they'll be afraid and they'll just leave. And the thing is, you can't do woke genocide. Like, there's no half measures in that situation. And that has just been eating away at the more reactionary components of the ultra-nationalist elements within Israel for generations now. That they're like, there's this constant back and forth of like, why haven't we done the full thing? And the other side saying like, well, you can't do the full thing, with more and more of the Jewish population of Israel getting on board with doing the full thing. This, for the record, this does not mean that this wasn't an forcible displacement ethnic cleansing campaign. It absolutely was. I've always maintained this position. I'm simply stating that in comparison to other genocides, it has been a slower burn. And if you are going to do a slow burn genocide, you can't do it. You got to do it fast. Genocide technique, you have to go in and you have to just like cut it out in like, maximum 10 years. And you can't do it when there's like a lot of communication and a lot of eyeballs on you. They thought that they could do it as a slow burn and would get some level of defense from the West, and they did. They did. The Western world definitely did originally turn a blind eye to it and then continued to facilitate and support it. That is a part of the problem. And you can't do that, and you especially can't do that in the 2020s. You can't do that in the 2020s, especially with the entirety of the Western world being on board with your actions. You can't do that in the 2020s with the internet readily available. Or if you do it in the 2020s, you got to do it kind of on your own. You can't really engage in this kind of behavior while also simultaneously, portraying yourself as the victim, right? Because like Jewish people historically do have an argument of being victimized by pogroms, by the Holocaust, but Israel does not have that argument. So it's this constant conflation of like, no, we're actually the ones who are striking, but also simultaneously, we ourselves are the victims. And that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Because, like, you hear that argument from the Klan, right? You hear that argument as it pertains to white supremacy in the United States of America. You hear that argument from the Klan. You hear Klansmen benefiting from white supremacy in the South and trying to desperately restore the racial pecking order, while simultaneously talking about how they are the real victims, like, black people coexisting and cohabitating next to white people actually is legitimately harming them. But the overarching population looks at that and goes, that's a little ridiculous, dog. How about you calm down? White people also have been, obviously, especially in the Western world, the historically dominant group. The categorization of like whiteness in the Western world implies that you have the power. So you don't have a good argument to make about hate crimes against you in general. If someone sits here and says, oh, there's white genocide, you immediately know, okay, this is a racist person. This person is not all right. Israel, on the other hand, can do that if it conflates itself with Judaism and being Jewish, because that is a protected, marginalized subgroup. That is certainly something that is real. It is something that happens. Having said that, however, like I said, you have to cut the two. The idea that like Israel somehow represents the interests of all Jews globally, and that Israel itself is like in and of itself not a nation state, a nuclear nation state that is getting a tremendous amount of military resources and political capital from the Western world in its endless endeavor to forcibly displace millions of Palestinians that it currently occupies. And instead, it's like actually the victim. It's just a nice Jewish family out for dinner being victim to an anti-Semitic hate crime. And it's not the case. Like, you're a military superpower, and you want to have it both ways, and you can't have it both ways, but that's always where the argument comes from. What do you mean they can't? They are and they will get away with it. I'm not sure I understand what you mean when you say they aren't going to get away with this. I just mean that, like, the truth will always remain. And the truth will prevail no matter what happens, I think.
Yesterday, South Africa had 3 hours. Today, Israel had 3 hours. That's it now in terms of the interim measures hearings. The judges will now go away and deliberate, look at what both sides have said. South Africa, of course, accusing Israel of genocide. Judges have to work out whether or not there is a plausible reason to believe that there could be a risk of genocide in order to rule in favor.
Also, do think that they're both sides' coverage on genocide already is, like, distasteful, to say the least. But beyond that, they are kind of leaning on the side of Israel as well. It's like the language being used here does almost immediately adopt the Israeli position. It even ends up reaffirming the Israeli propaganda position. For example, Israel's war on Hamas. When you hear that, when people say Israel versus Hamas, that in and of itself is an immediate, not even tacit, like open admission that you have taken Israel's propaganda hook, line, and sinker. Because the casualties do not reflect that. The targeting does not reflect that. Israel is targeting Hamas. The attitudes from Israeli Knesset members does not reflect that Israel is targeting Hamas. That is actually the fundamental counter argument that Israel makes, is that they are just simply doing this to combat Hamas, and oopsie, sometimes 30,000 almost people die. That framing in and of itself immediately adopts the position that Israel wants to adopt. So that's something to consider. Especially because the entire point of the South African court case is to say there is, one, no real self-defense argument under international law against those who Israel belligerently occupies. Israel is a belligerent occupier. Israel is and by that I mean like belligerent in the war term. Like Israel is a contentious foreign occupier upon the Palestinian population, and therefore there's no real international law defense here for Israel to engage in a self-defense against the Palestinian population. And then one of the more important parts about this is that the entire framing of this Israel versus Hamas battle is that it's not actually Israel versus Hamas, but this is genocidal intent. That's the perspective of the South African delegation, and I agree with that perspective. That framing is completely correct. So anyone that turns around and tries to say, no, you don't understand, actually, this is a war against Hamas. Israel has every right to, combat Hamas. Hamas is who they're trying to deal with, is engaging in my opinion, genocide apologia. And that it's a very commonplace position in the media because a lot of people don't think too much about it, right? Maybe myself, I have probably accidentally slipped up and said Israel versus Hamas in the past as well. So here is a genocide researcher and lecturer, and their take on a genocide survivor as well, their take on their analysis on Israel's defense. This is way, way worse of a defense by Israel than I expected. They are not at all arguing there is no genocide, nor against the fact that they're committing a genocide. They're focusing on jurisdiction in an attempt to get the case out on technicalities. However, I did call it, they're arguing that these individuals, people who have openly expressed genocidal intent, and therefore it can't be a systematic campaign of genocide, attempting to blur the genocidal intent by stating they're speaking as individuals. Now, South Africa's case relies on a direct line of communication from the top down, whether it be the defense minister, whether it be Benjamin Netanyahu, specifically the Amalek terminology that Benjamin Netanyahu used, the biblical terminology, and how that is translated from literally the top position in the state of Israel all the way down to the actual IDF soldiers, publicly reinforcing the narrative. And one of the major pieces of evidence that South Africa has been able to show in this regard has been obviously the Benjamin Netanyahu Amalek sentiment, right? And for those of you who don't know, Amalek is a reference, is a biblical reference to a complete elimination of even the children, the seed of an enemy, right? Of a violent enemy. It's a genocidal intent coming from this like biblical aspect. What they were able to do yesterday, the South African delegation was able to do yesterday, was show Benjamin Netanyahu and then draw a direct parallel from Benjamin Netanyahu to the soldiers on the ground singing and dancing and celebrating that they are also participating in an ethnic cleansing of and engaging in Amalek as well. Their argument hinges on the argument that the people saying these things, such as Ben Gvir and the soldiers, aren't part of the war cabinet